With the Neo Egoist League Arc, the Blue Lock manga might be in its most exciting point yet. The characters we've gotten to know and love are rapidly developing and approaching the highest level in the football world. But at the same time, Blue Lock is putting its core philosophy to the test like never before. Right now, Blue Lock is lifting the curtain to its most pertinent question. What actually is an egoist striker? Hello, my name is Sean, and I break down what makes great stories tick. Now, before I dive into Blue Lock's current story arc, I need to say a few things about the manga's philosophy in the earlier parts of the story. Blue Lock starts with an audacious claim that Japanese football is mediocre because its players are too cooperative, that they're lacking the ego to become number one. And so, the coach Shinpachi Ego, yes, that's actually his real name, founded a training facility with the goal to produce goals. Well, okay, I promise I won't make that joke again, ever. More concretely, the Blue Lock project aims to transform one of Japan's best high school strikers into the greatest striker in the whole world, into the ultimate egoist striker. Now, on first glance, this very premise seems absurd. After all, football is a team sport with 11 players working together to secure a victory. And indeed, the very first match in the manga demonstrates the problems with unfettered egoism. During the first selection, 5 teams of 11 strikers are pitted against each other. And the only ones to advance are the best 2 teams and the other teams, the losing team's best scorer. And these incentives manage to throw the first match into complete chaos. What we essentially get is the phenomenon that the philosopher Thomas Hobbes called a state of nature, which is a condition without any central authority, where everyone exclusively pursues their own interests. At the start of that match, all the football players completely disregard tactics and cooperation. They only focus on scoring goals themselves. So what the Blue Lock players have to learn here is how to turn everyone's innate ego into a productive strategy where each of them can bring out the best of their abilities. And in this way, Blue Lock is different from any other sports manga. It's a series that embraces the paradoxes inherent to football. The tension between seeking opportunities to score while also functioning as part of a greater whole. It really hammers home how an extraordinary striker requires an equally extraordinary desire to score, but that this egoistic drive also poses a constant threat to the team from within. So, after 100 chapters of selection, Blue Lock's philosophy of egoism is finally put to the test. The best players in Blue Lock face off against Japan's under-20 football team. But the fascinating thing here is that this game actually completely validates the values propagated by Blue Lock. It soon turns out that the regular under-20 players could not measure up to the best that Blue Lock has to offer. Instead, their team relies on 2 players from the outside to pose a threat to Blue Lock. There's a Japanese Real Madrid player who scorns the state of Japanese football, and a Blue Lock striker whose ego even Blue Lock could not handle, and who was then sent over to the under-20 team instead. But by doing this, the official Japanese team is forced to acknowledge Blue Lock's methods. So, in a sense, Blue Lock has won regardless of the match's actual outcome. And all this brings us to the current story arc. By this point, Blue Lock has proven itself against the under-20 team and has been hailed as the future of Japanese football. And so, the stage has been set for Blue Lock strikers to play on a global scale. And now we have the next, currently running story arc, where each of the Blue Lock players joins the under-20 division of one of 5 major European football clubs, and they all compete against the other teams. And at the start of this arc, Jinpachi Ego stresses how important it is to choose the right team. He notes that each country offers a unique environment with its own traditions and styles of play. So, for the Blue Lock players here, this offers a twofold challenge. They need to absorb what these world-class clubs have to offer, while also asserting their own egoism within an established framework. And so, Blue Lock's protagonist Yoichi Isagi, a striker with an exceptional spatial awareness, decides to join Germany's top team, Bayern München. Just as a heads up, I'm going to use the real-world team names here, if only because I want to avoid upsetting the almighty YouTube age restriction. Praise be to you. In Blue Lock, the German league distinguishes itself through its focus on rationality and logic. Their approach is guided by the belief that football is fundamentally a sport about scoring the most goals. Now, what's interesting about this portrayal of German football is that this claim echoes Jinpachi Ego's own words at the manga's first chapter. Ego disparages football players who prioritize cooperation and interpersonal relationships, because in his view, the only thing that matters in football is scoring more points than the opponent. And this is the way of thinking that led Ego to seek out the ultimate egoist striker. So then, this parallel leads to an exciting question. If the German Football League shares the football philosophy of Blue Lock's mastermind, does this mean that its top club has the same ambitions to produce the greatest egoist striker as well? The answer here is both yes and no. Bayern München is presented as a hyper-rational, statistics-driven club. It selects its players on the basis of quantifiable data rather than a philosophical conviction, be it egoism or anything else. But at the same time, this data drove Bayern to orientate their entire strategy around their greatest player and to do everything to enable that player's egoism. Enter Michael Kaiser, the star of Bayern's under-20 team. Kaiser is aiming at nothing less than becoming the best striker in the world. His mentality on this front becomes apparent as soon as he's introduced, because the first thing he does in the story is try to put Isagi, who at this point is the poster boy of Blue Lock, in his place. And as it turns out, Bayern's entire strategy revolves around Kaiser's extraordinary abilities. The team has one sole purpose, which is to let Kaiser score every goal with maximum efficiency. So in other words, the success of Bayern's strategy requires 10 subservient players to support a single exceptional egoist. But what's interesting is that this is not actually the first time that such a strategy has reared its head in Blue Lock. In fact, the way Bayern's team is built around Kaiser bears striking resemblance to the very beginning of the manga. As I mentioned earlier, Isagi's first match begins in a state of nature. It's a complete free-for-all between 20 players who are scrambling to score a goal. But then everything changes when the first goal is scored by Shohei Baro, who's a hulking mass of flesh. And by doing so, Baro establishes himself as the king of the field. And with his autocratic charisma, he transforms all of his teammates into his servants. They are made to pass every ball to Baro, and he in turn leads his team to an overwhelming 5-1 victory. But as Blue Lock's selection progresses, it becomes clear that Barrow's approach only works in the short term. Because then we get the second selection round, and Isagi and Barrow end up on the same team, on a team of 3, where they face off against 3 of Isagi's former teammates. And once again, Barrow demands that the entire team revolves around him scoring all the goals. King Barrow is such an extreme egoist that he refuses to pass to his teammates. And he's a player who will never, ever compromise on these principles. But this time, Barrow's self-centered playstyle falls short. The opposing team is completely in sync with each other, and this allows them to easily exploit Barrow's egoism. As it turns out, Barrow can only get so far with his single-minded mentality. And just like Barrow, you can only get so far trying to understand manga on your own. But don't worry, we're not living in the Blue Lock world. I'm more than happy to help you break down your favorite manga. So, don't be like Barrow. Subscribe to the channel now for more insight on Blue Lock and other manga that you love. So, this brings us to Michael Kaiser, the only other player who got an entire team to serve him. And the parallel with Barrow here is also signaled through Kaiser's name. Where Barrow is Blue Lock's king, Kaiser is the German word for emperor. And fittingly, Kaiser is so much more than Barrow could ever be. He has Barrow's kingly disposition, Isagi's spatial awareness, and an optimally efficient playstyle. In other words, Kaiser is hailed as perhaps the embodiment of Blue Lock's ideals. And this is where the Kaiser situation presents a paradoxical challenge to Blue Lock's philosophy. Bayern's strategy requires Kaiser's teammates to sacrifice their personal aspiration, and perhaps their career progression, for the benefit of their team and its best player. So, Bayern risks snuffing out 10 lights for the sake of one bright star. And this seems like a choice that could also lead to problems in the long run. After all, how would you even get a new egoist striker to emerge within such a system? And just like with Barrow in the earlier parts of the manga, you can't help but wonder if this short-term success won't be detrimental in the long run. So, at this point, the manga is posing a dilemma. Are Bayern and Kaiser Blue Lock's natural endpoint, or a dead end? In particular, the challenge for the Blue Lock players who joined Bayern München is that the egoistic playstyle that led them to victory against the Japanese under-20 team is now completely invalidated by the German approach. At the start of their first match with Bayern, one of them attempts an incredibly egoistic play. And for this, he's promptly ostracized by the Bayern regulars. So, the Blue Lock players who joined Bayern are struggling to find their place in their new environment. And this is put into relief even further through the contrast with their peers in the other teams. In particular, this first match highlights just how well Isagi's best friend, Megumi Bachira, fits in with his new team. Where Isagi ended up on the bench, Bachira immediately became one of Barcelona's star players. And while Isagi is still uncertain how to succeed in Kaiser's system, Bachira is flourishing in Barcelona's carefree, creative football culture. Isagi eventually concludes that there's only one real way to assert his value. In a paradoxical way, his most rational option is to play irrationally, to actively sabotage Kaiser and to disrupt Bayern's well-oiled machine. In other words, Isagi has to take the egoistic choice. He has to endanger the success of his team for his personal benefit. And so, the match between Bayern München and Barcelona ends up with Isagi stealing the ball from Kaiser and setting up a goal with Blue Lock's signature strategy of having everyone's unrestrained egoism bounce off each other. And then, since Isagi has now proven this playstyle's effectiveness, the rational, data-driven German team has no choice but to incorporate it into their strategy going forwards. So then, we go to Bayern's second and most recent match against Manchester City. And with Isagi's success in the previous game, he's now been promoted to the starting lineup. And what's more, Blue Lock's presence is becoming increasingly palpable in the Bayern team. And at the same time, this match also highlights that Isagi and Kaiser are fundamentally cut from the same cloth. Since Isagi and his allies refuse to pass to Kaiser, Kaiser starts stealing the ball from Isagi as well, doing the same thing that the Blue Lock players have been doing to them beforehand. And Isagi, in turn, takes over Bayern's rhetoric. Towards the end of the match, he tries to ally himself with his fellow Blue Lock player Kenyu Yukimura. In Isagi's words, working together would be the most rational course of action for both of them. So here, it seems that Bayern's focus on logic and rationality has rubbed off on Isagi as well. But to Isagi's shock, Yukimura blatantly rejects his proposal. In Yukimura's view, this appeal to logic is nothing more than a trick to make him bend to Isagi's will. He understands that Isagi is trying to do the exact same thing to him as what Kaiser is doing to the team at large. And as Isagi later realizes, Yukimura's observation was on the ball. I'm sorry, these football puns just keep writing themselves. It's very hard to stop. In any case, Isagi's appeal to rationality was indeed just a farce, just an attempt to impose his will on his teammates. And since the manga stresses just how similar Isagi and Kaiser really are, it seems like this conclusion must then be applicable on a broader scale as well. Blue Lock is suggesting that rationality is just a self-serving rhetorical trick that the strong use to justify their rule. All this talk of logic and rationality has only turned Kaiser's teammates into pawns in the hands of their emperor, in the hands of the team's greatest egoists. But there's even more that's significant about this clash between Isagi and Yukimura. This scene is actually another callback to Barrow's conduct during the Blue Lock selections. There as well, Isagi failed to convince a teammate to play his way. Once again, Isagi thought that cooperation would benefit the team as a whole. But then, in Barrow's eyes, Isagi was just trying to rein in his ego and force him into submission. So, just like with Yukimura, the conflict between Isagi and Barrow is revealed to be a struggle for dominance, with each of them trying to impose their way of playing on the other. And in both cases, the clash between two egos leads to a mutually destructive impasse. Now, given Blue Lock's internal logic, it makes perfect sense that true egoists would not see eye to eye. After all, the manga's very premise is that cooperation and friendship are a sign of weakness. That a world-class striker is also a world-class egoist. And it's only once Isagi abandons his original assumptions about football and adapts to Barrow's disposition, instead of trying to get Barrow to adapt to him, that he can turn the tides of a losing match. After he really understands the situation from Barrow's perspective, he figures out a way to use his teammates' stubbornness to his advantage. He starts using Barrow's egoistic plays as bait, and he keeps humiliating Barrow throughout the match until Barrow finally snaps and starts playing in a way that he has never played before. So in other words, Isagi turns Barrow into his pawn, and in doing so, Isagi achieves exactly what Barrow's more simple-minded egoism could not. Isagi here finds a way to use his teammates for the sake of his own goals. And so, it's fitting that the method Isagi used to dethrone Blue Lock's king also anticipates how he will eventually surpass its emperor. During the match against Manchester City, Isagi achieves 2 breakthroughs. The first of these is a technical skill that he steals off of Kaiser. Isagi notices how Kaiser uses his peripheral vision to observe and control the playing field, and he starts doing the same thing. This allows Isagi to catch up with Kaiser in terms of reaction speed, but still, the additional sensory input is not enough on its own. After all, Isagi's physical abilities are still inferior to those of Bayern's ace. Instead, what truly allows Isagi to surpass Kaiser is a tactical, philosophical realization. And rightly so. After all, everything that has been established to this point would be undermined if Isagi would beat Kaiser by just running slightly faster or something along those lines. The manga has made Kaiser out as the absolute pinnacle of efficiency and built him up as the embodiment of everything the Blue Lock program is striving for. So, on a narrative level, the only justifiable way for Isagi to beat Kaiser is by surpassing him in terms of ego. And that's exactly what happens. What Isagi realizes after failing to get through to Yukimura is the exact same thing he realized with Barrow, but now on an unprecedented scale. Isagi can adapt to any football player because each player is driven by a form of egocentrism, by the belief that they are the protagonists of their own story. And looking back now, it becomes clear that Isagi's attempts to reason with Barrow and Yukimura were bound to fail as long as those two could sense that Isagi was subconsciously treating them like the supporting players in his own story. So, what Isagi has to do instead is transcend his own ego, just like he did with Barrow. If Isagi focuses on the story that another player is trying to tell, what he can do is anticipate their behavior and use their drive to his advantage. And what's so brilliant about this breakthrough is not just that it takes ideas that were already present in Blue Lock and brings them to their logical conclusion. More than that, the notion that everyone views themselves as the protagonists of sorts has already been woven into this story arc at multiple stages. For one, Manchester's coach actively encouraged his Blue Lock players to view themselves as the protagonists of their own life. And he seems to have succeeded on this front as well, because when Nagi, who's one of the Manchester players, scores the greatest goal of his life, Nagi feels like the protagonist of the world. And for the most part, Manchester's coach was right to encourage this sensation. After all, Blue Lock has established that egocentrism is absolutely necessary for a player to achieve maximum performance. But even more importantly, the idea that football stars view themselves as the protagonists was established at the very start of the arc. Specifically, in Kaiser's introduction. As it turns out, Michael Kaiser's boast to Isagi that he is the true protagonist is actually the setup for his own downfall. In an ironic twist, the very belief that allowed both Kaiser and the Manchester players to reach the peak of their abilities is also an Achilles heel for Isagi to exploit. It allowed him to see further into the future than even Kaiser himself for a brief second. And with this, we're given a final paradox to Blue Lock's philosophy, that the greatest egoist is the player who can transcend their own ego. Now, where are we going from here with 2 games remaining in the arc? For one, Isagi has realized that right now it's his physical abilities that are his bottleneck. So I suspect that upgrading those will be his main objective for the 3rd match. And this is corroborated by the fact that Barrow, of all people, is being set up as that match's most significant opponent. After all, there is no better obstacle for Isagi on this front than the player who from the beginning of the story has represented the pinnacle of strength and technique. And secondly, here's my best guess for the arc's finale. As I noted earlier, the match between Bayern München and Manchester City exposed Bayern's so-called rationalism for what it is. It's just a convenient frame for Kaiser to impose his egocentric will on his teammates. And so, I wouldn't be surprised if by the end of the arc, the strategy with Kaiser at its center will be completely dismantled. Blue Lock's influence will make even Kaiser's original teammates see through the lie and abandon collectivism in favor of their own interests. And with that, Isagi will bring about the vow he made earlier in the arc, to destroy Kaiser and everything he stands for.